welcome everybody to our reading. And let's see, everyone will be muted except for the speaker. And at the end of our reading, it'll be opened up for questions and discussions, comments, and we'll tell you what to do at that time. And I just want to say many thanks to the Truro Council on Aging for this first time ever Zoom public reading of the Truro Memoirs Group. We meet every Monday morning from 10 to 12:30. And this past year that's been on Zoom. The program is free and our doors open. The poet Muriel Rukeyser said that the universe is connected by stories, not atoms. And that is the foundational principle behind memoirs. By listening to our stories, we connect with each other. And by writing our stories, we often find enlightening connections with ourselves. So our first reader will be Bridget.
Thank you, Roz. I'm going to read Soft Day. A pointless argument with my spouse drives me straight out of our apartment and into Central Park. I'm walking fast, focused hard on being right and feeling wronged. The path around the pond is littered with flower petals, pink, white, yellow. Rain hangs in the air, bringing out countless shades of green, arching over and along the path. I blur my eyes to let the colors merge and feel the mist on my lashes. 'Tis a soft day, I whisper, remembering the way the country people in Ireland greeted us in weather like this. That was when I lived for a year as a freckled Irish child in the careless care of happy parents. On a day like this, we abandoned our car on the public road in Wicklow and made our way on foot to visit friends. The track through the fields was too sodden to drive. Apart from the mud, there's too many gates to latch and unlatch, entirely too much getting in and out of the car, they'd said. Galumphing along in galoshes, I think I was the first to catch sight of the peat smoke rising into the sky. Closer in, we glimpsed whitewashed stone huddling under heavy thatch. Closer still was the pungent smell of wet hay mixed with manure as we passed the open shed where that massive flesh-colored sow lay nursing her long row of tiny, eager piglets. Arriving inside, kind hands hurried us over to the fire. We children sat barefoot right inside the fireplace as our woolen socks hung drying from the mantel. We were amazed to be sitting on blackened benches carved right out of the wall. Amazed again after supper to find our bunk beds were carved the same way, only white with gentle, rounded edges. We lay under comforters on mattresses stuffed with straw, lulled to sleep by the murmur of grown-ups talking deep into the night. The next day was Easter. Wearing our galoshes, we carried straw baskets as we searched for colored eggs up along the thatched roof, around the yard, and even warily on tippy toes inside the shed where that fearsome sow was still suckling her babies. I'm remembering all this as I round the pond to discover a little gray poodle off the leash and racing towards me. He reaches up to greet me, placing his muddy forepaws on my jeans. His owner shouts for him to sit, but the dog is already down and looking up at me with bright black eyes and a wide, doggy grin. It's okay, I call, as I pat the poodle on the head, feeling warm skull under dull, damp gray curls. I'm laughing at his eager stump of a tail wagging his entire bottom half. Turning towards home, I whisper to myself once again that it's a soft day and slow my step to let love come in. The next reader will be Josh Stiles. Thank you.
Since it's Father's Day, I'm going to read this memoir called Push 'em Up, Puccinello. George Altman, a new hope for the pathetic Mets, was up early in the game against the Cubs at Wrigley. I glanced over at my dad on the couch. His eyes were squinted, exuding happy concentration, with his lips slightly puckering, then relaxing in rapid succession. His eyes were squinted, exuding happy concentration. Sorry. I had a feeling I'd seen that look before, then it hit me. He did that when he was writing a note in a birthday card and when he was addressing a golf ball, a kind of relaxed immersion. And I had seen it watching my grandmother, his mother, as she was stirring wheatina. I knew something profound was cooking in his mind. From the side of his mouth, he said, "This guy Altman is due." It wasn't like my dad had ever said this before, but that afternoon, while sitting there with a cigar and reheated coffee, with our beagle mutt Daisy asleep on his side, he proclaimed this with conviction, and also as if he was an eternally hopeful kid too, with a sudden premonition. My brother and I made quick eye contact. We knew not to expect much from the Mets, but this comment got to us. If this was a scene in a movie, I'd be skeptical. Literally on the next pitch, Altman parked one. It was uncanny timing. It happened. Bob Murphy was calling the play. "This ball is way back there." We felt hope. Deep to left field. When he said deep like that, it was a very good sign. This ball is going, gone. Actually, by the time he said the first going, he was 100% sure it was a homer. If Ralph Kiner, another Mets announcer, had been calling the play, he would have just proclaimed on the crack of the bat, "Gone." Kiner was a Hall of Famer, so he could tell it was a homer that quickly. My brother and I looked at my dad with wide-eyed amazement, trying to digest what had just happened. And he gave us a half smile with his eyebrows raised. He was pleased, but he was being modest, as if it was a lucky call. I was just a kid, so this made a huge impression. My mother used to wonder why my father had such influence on his kids. This type of baseball moment was impossible to explain to her. There are some things in life that are learned by playing, like pay close attention to your surroundings, stay on your toes, study and know your opposition. Don't get overconfident about a one-run lead. Actually, it was partly my mother's own doing. She must have read in Dr. Spock that it was be healthy if she highlighted our father's positive features. She had a clever way of using this evolving situation to her advantage. Whenever she wanted me to do something and I balked, she would invoke my father's opinion. "Your father thinks you should be doing something enriching and stimulating this summer." Or, "Your father is concerned you might be spending too much time playing hockey at Tom's Pond and not putting enough effort into your homework." He didn't talk that way, and it sounded fishy, but it worked for a long time. So back to the game. The Mets nursed a precarious one-run lead at the bottom of the ninth. My father said to the TV as the Mets pitcher readied for the first batter, "All right, for crying out loud, don't walk the first man. Cardinal rule, make him a batter." Baseball was about the feel of the game to him. One of his favorite stories was how his college coach, Paul Eckley, had a sixth sense, an ability to know exactly when to try to steal a base. He would just look at the runner taking a lead off first, and without sending out any secret signal, would just point to second, meaning go on the pitch. Allegedly, it always worked. My dad also loved to tell about a mediocre minor leaguer for the Rochester Red Wings that he watched as a kid, a player who was particularly good at one thing, advancing base runners, known to the fans as Push 'em Up Puccinello, a name my father said with great relish, throwing his hands up in the air with his palms open to the sky and a pleased smile on his face. That awesome nickname, reeking of the love of baseball, was part of why he loved telling the story. But also there was an implicit meaning there too. Batter wanted to win and would sacrifice himself to the cause. It wasn't about individual stats. Back to the game. The Mets manager, Casey Stengel, apparently agreed with my father because the pitcher walked the first man. My father gritted his teeth and mumbled, "Christ," as Casey walked to the mound and called for a single ball pitcher. The next batter hit a slow grounder that got a force out. The next guy struck out. My brother and I were getting quite giddy. Only one out to a really big and rare Mets victory. My father glanced at us with a pained look in his eyes, then relit his cigar, sucked his teeth, as he often did before imparting some wisdom to his sons, and pointed out that the next batter was Ernie Banks. A ball player's ball player, he said, then ominously adding, with his eyes growing wide, mouth compressed, indicating helplessness, "I'm a very good low ball hitter." Almost like he was saying, "You boys are old enough to know these things now." I felt my heart sink. It never occurred to me that a batter could prefer a low pitch. Why a low pitch? I felt skeptical, but my father said it with such authority that it made Banks seem like almost superhuman. Banks fell one off, took a couple balls. Then as the Mets pitcher looked into the catcher for the sign, my father, with a cigar clenched between his teeth, barked impulsively to the TV, "Don't give him a low fastball." It created a supernatural air of dread and inevitability. Suddenly it was over. Banks hit a 2-run homer that ended the game. We sat there in stunned silence until we overheard Ralph Kiner doing a post-game wrap-up, pointing out to Bob Murphy, "That was right where Banks likes him, Bob, low fastball." When he said that, my dad just shook his head. It infuriated me to the point I felt dizzy that the Mets pitcher would be that stupid. My father stood up and started gritting his teeth. He started pulling on his nose with his thumb and his forefinger. Then took a deep breath and exhaled very slowly and said, "Ah, well," as if he had faced disappointment before and would again, which was generous because he actually liked the Cardinals. He just hated to see his kids suffer. "Hang in there, boys," he said as he went to the kitchen to warm up more coffee. Our next reader is Susie.
Thank you, Josh. I'm Susie Epley, and here's my story. To every season, turn, turn, turn. It's summer's turn again. Strong sun and surprisingly strong memories of way back when I was 5 to 10 maybe, when Christine, my younger cousin, and I were left in the care of Nanny, Mom's aunt, and Grandma, Mom's mother, and Nanny's sister-in-law. Those two old ladies, younger than I am now, but looking old as the hills to Christine and I way back then, catered to us like royalty, at least compared to back home with Mom and Dad and the mayhem of an ever-increasing number of brothers and sisters. I was loved there, I knew, but with Nanny and Grandma, ice cream at the beach, getting to pick out a toy at Woolworth's 5 and 10 was the usual, not the occasional treat. Plus at home, the adults were often off by themselves. At Nanny and Grandma's, whatever was happening, Christine and I were right in the thick of it. Okay, two types of what they were into way back when Christine and I were not so eager to be in the thick of. First type, Nanny and Grandma spent way too much time at auctions and secondhand stores. Who cared about dusty boxes of used dishes and household junk or musty, scratched up furniture? They had plenty of that stuff already. Second type, even worse. We would leave very early, and this left Uncle Willie, Nanny's second husband. Why did she have two, we always wondered, reading in his Barcalounger, cat on his lap, pipe at his side, to drive way out into the country to some abandoned property where the two old ladies knew how to find Concord grapes tangled up in vines or berries on branches full of prickers. Okay, picking the first pail was fun, but after that, sweating in the hot sun, swatting at flying things trying to land on you, and the response to "I have to pee" being "so go in the bushes." Bushes with snakes and monsters was my thinking. And if not these free for the picking places, it was you pick places, peaches or tomatoes mostly, and pick we did, bushels full. When Christine and I got whiny, their response was, "Just keep picking, for God's sake." Nanny and Grandma had stamina that Christine and I did not. Nanny also said shit a lot, but Christine and I knew it was bad when little kids said that. Then, when the truck was and the back seat were finally full, Christine and I elbowing each other for the 2 inches of space left to us, it got thicker. Grandma always drove. It was late and Willie would be upset. Dinner would be late. Nanny told Grandma to take the shortcut. No, Christine and I pleaded. We knew. What? Why didn't Grandma knew? The dreaded shortcut always got us lost, for God's sake. We were starving and would not get home till after dark. For God's sake, somehow, I don't remember the details, Nanny and Grandma cooked dinner, We all ate it. The kitchen was tidied up and off to bed we went to live another day, to run to the candy store down the block with the 5 cents Willie had pulled from his pocket for each of us, to pour through the top drawer of Nanny's bedroom bureau, rearranging all the costume jewelry, trying out her lipsticks and the Lily of the Valley perfume, to count the hundreds of dollars that were piled behind the knitting needles in the upstairs sunroom sewing closet, to swim at the beach while Nanny and Grandma sat on their blanket in their black wool bathing suits, to watch them repairing that old junk from those auctions upended on the huge table in the cellar, to watch the busyness in the kitchen with the making of lasagna for the bridge club that was coming the next day, to the furiously cleaned living room where the 16 ladies would sit at the 4 tables, each one with hair in tight curls and waves, wearing black or dark purple dresses with lace collars, to wiggle impatiently on the stool while being measured for a new dress, the worst being when you had to stand up there for the pinning of the hem, to get to pick roses for the cut glass vases in the living room from Nanny's side garden, being very careful, of course, with the big scissors, to hunt in the attic for treasures, to let Grandma scratch my back for hours and then scratch hers for 2 minutes for a nickel, to learn that when Nanny asked if we wanted beets for dinner, she meant a pizza, to sit with Nanny and Grandma and Willie, who was usually snoring, to watch Arthur Godfrey and the Andrews sisters, remembering that very special day we were actually in the second row of the audience watching everything, even the camera crew, to run down the upstairs hallway and jump out onto our beds 90 times before laying down on it to go to sleep. During those summers at Nanny and Grandma's, those 2 white witches who made magic for Christine and myself also left me with a kind of curse. I cannot forego, ignore, or resist the lure of an auction, secondhand store, berry patch, or you-pick place. And I have this strong preference for old, well-used over big box new. May I never get over those formative summers from way back when, but I won't, because those 2 old ladies were onto something. It just took 60 years of living, for God's sake, to catch on fully, to appreciate all the value of what they were up to way back when. The end. And our next reader is Grace.
Thank you, Susie. I'm not going to tell the title of my story because it'll give it away. You have to go, my mother implored. You will always be able to say you went iguana hunting in the Pamet with Robert J. Lifton. She had a point for sure. Famed psychiatrist and psychohistory writer Robert J. Lifton and his wife, equally famous child psychologist and writer Billie Jean Lifton, had a pet iguana. Robert had let it escape from its cage one night. The time was around 9 p.m. and I couldn't fathom how anyone would find a missing iguana in the wild at night. Bob and BJ were crossovers with many of the groups we associated with on the Cape. They were writers, they were tennis players, and they hosted dancing parties similar to, but not as wonderful as our own. Each year they would move most of their library books from New York City to the Cape, much to the chagrin of Sherb Valley, who ran the truck from New York to the Cape. I recall the summer he was almost in traction after BJ found boxes even larger than the ones she packed each year. They were so wonderful because you could fit so many more books inside, BJ crooned. They each had very separate writing spaces on flanking sides of the main house, perched on the cliffs of the ocean in Wellfleet. I could picture them eating a reluctant breakfast together in the main house, counting the seconds until they could go to their respective corners. Still, it would have been a memorable story, despite my mother's penchant for exaggeration. Hyperbolic Mom was a nickname that I used for her. But they don't even live in Truro, I protested. I know, but it sounds romantic to say the Pamet, doesn't it? I was too pragmatic to find the romance in walking the dunes to find a missing chameleon or whatever. I pictured ticks lurking everywhere while the cold wind whipped wet sand at my face. In the dubious event that I found the small pet, the thanks would be minimal if not missing entirely. I knew Bob and BJ too well. They were not people who thanked others. Years later, she would accost me at a gallery opening, asking me if I felt that it was my fault that my parents got divorced. Nice going for a child psychologist. I also wondered why my mother wasn't going to join the search party. Why did it have to be me? But I knew the answer to this question. Her days of riding across country on the back of a motorcycle and building houseboats in Maine were over now. She was still daring in her writing and her social life, but the adventures were, for the most part, finished. Now it was time for her to live through me. Thank you, and our next reader will be Diane.
Okay, hi everybody. I'm Diane Green. I'm going to read you the very first piece that I ever wrote for Memoirs in 2011. It's interesting to see where we start, and some of you have heard this. This is called Mr. Hurwitz. Living in a 12-story building with 6 apartments on each floor, as I did in Parkchester in the Bronx, one was provided with endless entertainment without even going outside. Mr. Hurwitz lived on the 5th floor. He had 2 daughters, Phyllis and Barbara Hurwitz. Now, Phyllis was already a pretty good ventriloquist, but she would later change her name to Shari Lewis and become an incredible ventriloquist. But this isn't about Shari, it's about her father, Mr. Hurwitz. Now, Mr. Hurwitz was a magician. In fact, he was the honorary magician of New York City. But I was a smart 11-year-old tomboy, and I knew that the tricks he performed only looked like magic. There were always explanations. I really liked Mr. Hurwitz because he was so entertaining, plus really nice. One time when he and his wife Anne came up to our apartment for dinner, it was getting late and my father wanted me to go to bed. But it was so much fun to watch Mr. Hurwitz do tricks that I didn't want to leave. So Mr. Hurwitz says to me, Diane, if you pick a card out of your own deck and hide it, and I guess it on the first try, will you go to bed? Ah, sure, Mr. Hurwitz, I thought, you're really going to be able to do that. Okay, I said, quite sure of myself. So I got my cards and I picked one out. It was the 3 of spades. I went into my room to hide the card in the pocket of my dungarees, and being no fool, I made sure to leave my deck in my room. Mr. Hurwitz wasn't going to get the best of me. With a smug expression on my face, I walked back into the living room. What's my card? I asked him. Mr. Hurwitz looked me in the eyes, thought a moment, then smiled and said, 3 of spades. I didn't say anything. Right? He asked. They were all looking at me expectantly. Right, I said. My mother gasped, then clapped. My father just smiled and told me to get ready for bed. I just knew I had been tricked somehow, but I couldn't figure out how he had done it. I didn't see Mr. Hurwitz again until a few months later. I was on the elevator heading for the ground floor so I could go outside. Clasped in my hand was the nickel my mother always gave me every day to buy a good humor fudgicle. Mr. Hurwitz got on the 5th floor and seemed happy to see me, giving me a warm hello from the other end of the elevator room. He looked at my fist, which was closed around the nickel. What you got there? He asked. A nickel for a good humor bar, I answered. Then he looked into my eyes, just like he did that time with the card, and said, look again. Look again. And I swear to you, I opened up my own hand, which I knew it had a nickel in it, and there, no lie, there was a dime. Now look, I was a really smart kid, and my mother always gave me a nickel for a good humor. But there it was, a dime. By this time, the elevator stopped on the ground floor. Have a nice day, Diane, Mr. Hurwitz said, walking out and whistling. So I guess Mr. Hurwitz was a magician. And in fact, some years later, Mr. Hurwitz was inducted in the Magician Hall of Fame. Now, you might not believe that magic, real magic, exists. I suggest you read a relatively new book called Real Magic by a scientist, Dean Radin. One chapter is entitled 3 Merlin Glass Magicians, and the author cites innumerable examples of inexplicable instances which can only be called magic. I believe Mr. Hurwitz would qualify as a 4th Merlin Glass magician. I also recently came upon a quote of his, which I will read. He said this: "What impresses a child or pleases her will remain in her mind a long time. When you make a child happy, you delight her not only for the moment, but through her memories and associations for many years to come, perhaps for a lifetime." Well, it has been a lifetime, and that experience of magic with Mr. Hurwitz has lasted a lifetime, allowing me to open up to magic in my life. Thank you. Our next reader is Chris.
Thank you, Diane. My name is Chris Seeker. Did you ever catch a moment, like when you look at white puffy clouds with bright sunshine, and it almost stirs a memory? Like maybe of being a kid lying in the hammock looking at clouds, but that doesn't feel like it. Or like holding a fresh opened can of coffee up to my nose, remembering how my mother used to let me open the can, twisting the metal key around the top. Smell brought back the coffee memory, but I don't know how the clouds do it. The cloud one stirs a feeling of childhood wonder, of magic, that doesn't seem to belong to a particular place. I read a short story once called The Daring Young Man on the Flying Trapeze. Maybe that was the name of the book, and it was one story. My sister and I used to swing on ropes in the backyard. One, if I remember, looped down between two trees. I think we did somersaults around it. So I am sure my sister and I pretended we were the daring young man on the trapeze. So maybe when I saw the book in a used bookstore, it felt like I should read it. Anyway, the story, or the part of it I remember, is that there is a not very old man who is an artist, and he has no money for food. So he is dying in an apartment in New York City. He is looking out the window at the clouds over the Hudson River, and he thinks to himself that after he dies, these same clouds will continue along in the same way. There was something about that image that made death more real, maybe terribly mundane, but real. Like after my stepfather died, I was not close with him and did not cry or feel intense grief. He had a sudden heart attack just before going to a meeting of the Village Historical Society, and my mother had tried to resuscitate him. I had been out of the country when he died and got home a few days later. When I went to the refrigerator that evening, I saw a part of a one-layered store-bought cake in a tin. My stepfather was rather rigid in how he did things. So for breakfast, he made eggs a certain way depending on what day it was. So I saw lines where the knife had pressed down into the cake tin, marking off squares where the pieces had been taken out by him. That suddenly hit me with a jolt, that he had made those marks, and that he would never make any more marks like that, like death right in front of me. I read a story by Farley Mowat about a dog when I was at a conference a few years ago in Washington, D.C., and staying with a friend. I was alone in my room late at night, and I cried and sobbed, the sort of sobs that make you feel like you can't get a breath. The story told how the dog didn't come home, and his owner went to look for him. He followed his tracks in the snow. He knew his dog very well. When the tracks stopped by a pond, he knew how his dog would look around there. He continued following and knowing what his dog had done pretty much at each turn. But then he came to a road and found that a truck had probably hit him and knocked him dead into a ditch. I don't know why that story hit me so hard. It was something about the man who loved his dog so much and how he followed the last steps that his dog had made, sort of like the marks in the cake tin. And maybe like the clouds that were moving before the man dies and will continue to move the same way after he dies, even though clouds don't leave marks in the sky. Thank you. The next reader is Ray.
Thanks, Chris. I'm Raymond Clark. I'm going to read the first portion of the opening chapter of my memoir. The chapter is entitled Creativity. It was Saturday night, 1968, and the graduate students at the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies were having their annual Halloween party. The room was crowded with costume partiers, drinking punch and talking animatedly, when in walked a slender student dressed in black pants, black t-shirt. Moreover, his shiny dark hair was plastered down and there were black streaks running down his face. That student was me. I had oiled my hair and used black eyeliner to draw gobs running down my face. Weird. Most people dress as pirates, Romans, celebrities, and the like. And here was me doing my strange thing. And what was I? An oil slick. I don't know why I did such an unconventional thing. It probably has something to do with my desire to make a statement about costume parties. I'm critical of them for reasons that are not clear to me. At some level, I'm saying, you want a costume? Let me show you a costume. I'm truly perplexed by this attitude. In any case, I've never gone to a party in a conventional costume. I've always appeared dressed in strange ways that are confounding to others and require my explaining what I am representing. And depending on who's receiving that explanation, I get a reaffirming nod or a puzzled look. For example, I was invited to a department Halloween party at Cornell University the fall after my sabbatical year on St. Croix. I wore a crown consisting of a thin piece of sheet metal with about 20 small nails sticking from it. When asked to explain my costume, I answered, I'm a spiny head blenny. That got knowing looks from nobody. So I spent the evening repeatedly explaining that a spiny head blenny was one of the fish that I studied. It lives in tight-fitting holes in coral, and its spine-covered head can plug the hole. And in the first few weeks of my year-long stay on St. Croix, I appeared at the lab Halloween party in shorts, a t-shirt, and flip-flops, standard tropical lab attire. But my head was crowned with a small light atop a tiny cardboard tube. I had rigged a flashlight bulb with some wires that ran into my pocket where they were connected to a battery. What was I? Buck Island. Buck Island sat a couple of miles off the north coast where the West Indies lab was located. It had a navigational light sitting on a tower that flashed in the night sky and was visible from the lab, a constant presence. Denny Hubbard, the faculty member hosting the party, told me later that he would have honored me with the worst costume award, but I was new then and he did not know me well enough. The last time I went to a costume party was several years later in New York City. In preparation, I crumpled several sheets of newspaper into balls and glued them onto an old baseball cap. After spray painting the whole thing green, I had my costume. I was a head of broccoli, of course. And head it was. For some reason, my costumes were centered on my head. I never dressed up. So there you go. I am a generally shy person, not good at making cocktail party conversation, and usually trying to avoid drawing attention to myself, except at Halloween parties. Maybe those costumes were lures. Just as an anglerfish cannot chase down its prey, but uses a lure to entice them in, maybe I adapted my own hesitation in starting conversations by creating lures to draw people in. What are you supposed to be? Is a conversation starter, and I got others to initiate it. Although these costumes were icebreakers, as far as I can recall, I did not consciously design them for that purpose. But who knows what motivations lurk in the unconscious mind. And where did the inspiration for these get-ups come from? I have no idea. You can ask the same about how scientific hypotheses entered my head. Sometimes a train of thought is clear, and the creative idea is a small parallel jump. For example, my hypothesis that the different metabolic rates of two fishes I studied might determine the outcome of fights came after I read a report of African dung beetles showing that the ones with the higher body temperatures were more likely to win fights. An illustration of how a big leap comes into a scientist's head is the inspiration for the geometry of the benzene molecule. In 1862, the German scientist August Kekuli knew the number of carbon and hydrogen atoms in a molecule, but could not arrange them into a chain. While dozing in front of a fire in Ghent, Belgium, he had a dream of a snake seizing its own tail, and suddenly saw that the benzene molecule was a ring. That was the first time anyone had hypothesized a ring structure for a molecule. I'll stop there. The chapter goes on to discuss creativity in science. And our next reader is Marjorie.
Thanks, Ray. My name is Marjorie Block. And since I celebrated a biggish Gemini birthday this past week, the two short poems I'm reading acknowledge the old woman. The first poem is Bones. At the entrance to the beech forest, frosted in snow, wild birds hover somewhere between a bare branch and an outstretched palm covered in sunflower seed. Like bubbles waved from a wand, they light, weightless, on the edge of a feast. One seed at a time, one chickadee at a time, as if waiting for a seat at a lunch counter, where the waitress smiles and the customer settles on a silver stool and knows she's in safe hands, and the coffee will be hot and the cream pie silk. Circling, one tufted titmouse drops to the pad of a finger, the touch airy like the bones of an old woman, thin and hollow on the inside, light enough, at last, she can fly above the tallest branch of a bone-white beech. The second poem, to my granddaughter. It's like this. Early morning, an old woman is watering chives that come back every summer in the faded green window box on the back deck. Some mornings, the old woman snips handfuls to sprinkle on her omelet, giving it a faint taste of garlic. Once, this old woman would have been my grandmother, your great-great-grandmother, kneeling under a hot sun, planting radishes in Russian dirt, her hands growing red and large, like mine, the knuckles round and shiny, and some days hurting like the hands of my mother, your grandmother, hovering over her Sabbath candles, blessing us all. In summer, she was smiling and happy, like you today. It's your turn, after all, to push off. If all goes well, it's like this, the way of things. Thank you. Our next reader is Judith.
Thank you, Marjorie. I wrote this essay in the middle of the pandemic, and I dedicate it to the father of my children, John. Happy Father's Day. It's called The Quantum Physics of Old Married Love. I am a potter, so making money with mud has many perks besides raking in cash at craft fairs and meeting men who like to shop. One time, this guy with a kind face hung around my booth as I watched him tenderly pick up each pot like a newborn baby. It was as if pottery pheromones were buzzing between us, something to this day I can't explain. But 2 days later, and it was really 2 days later, he moved into my loft, and 3 children and thousands of pots later, we're still married. During this god-awful pandemic, I find myself running back and forth to the kitchen when it's time to whip up dinner for my husband, in between mixing glazes for pots. Sometimes there is an overlap of ingredients, and John likes to joke about my terrible cooking when he asks if I might have dropped clay in the cream sauce by mistake, or perhaps I salted my glaze. The way I see it, why put hours of effort into cooking a meal when it's gone in 30 minutes? When hours of effort making a pot might last 10,000 years. Because I've been married to John forever, we have perfected the art of creating space between us, a social distancing embedded in our love. During lockdown, I go into my studio and make pots all day while he reads physics books on the couch, eating cookies. And in a strange way, we are studying the same things. While I move molecules of clay, water, and fire, I find him horizontal on the couch, delving into the principles of how matter is neither created nor destroyed. At the end of our separate days, we hook up to watch TV, hungry for news about New York City, where we raised our kids along with raising a pottery business. We think of ourselves as refugees from New York who are lucky enough to live on Cape Cod, especially now. So after TV, it's a bonus that we can sneak out to Herring Cove Beach in Provincetown to catch the sunset, an event we can count on when so much of the world has changed. When John and I watch TV, we hold hands in front of the flickering light as the numbers and statistics about the pandemic parade across the screen like Morse code that I just can't fathom. Lately, I confess, I pepper my husband with science questions, eager for answers, trying to make sense of the new normal, like going through a pile of fortune cookies until I get a good one. I ask him, tell me, what are the statistical chances that the virus will return next year? I want to know. During this strange pandemic pause in our lives, John has taken to unloading kilns and cooking, while I rifle through his science magazines looking for answers. This has given me time to think about the big stuff in life. And I've come up with a science question of my own to ask John. I think it's a stumper. After we eat John's experimental veggie burgers, I take a deep breath and lay out my query. If 1 pot plus 1 pot equals 2 pots, then why is your love plus my love way more than twice the love? Fusion, he says. What's fusion, I ask? Think of it as fusion, a binding so intense that it releases tremendous energy as two become one. Really, I say? He's so excited that I'm asking. He goes off on a tear about the core of the sun and protons and hydrogen and things I just can't follow. But I tell him, I'm not sure what Einstein would say about this, but it sounds like the quantum physics of old married love, like you and me. Thank you, and the next reader is Margaret.
Thanks, Judith. I'm Margaret Phillips. This is a memoir that comes from my childhood, and you may hear my child voice coming through now and then. My 4th grade teacher is my favorite teacher. Mrs. Picard was nice to us kids. When she asked questions, she wanted to know if we understood and knew what we were learning. Answers were important to her. She didn't get mad when we didn't know things. She wanted to know if the question was too hard or why we didn't know whatever it was. And when she asked us questions about things outside of school, she asked because she wanted to know. She waited for us to think before we answered. I was glad to be in her class and to be asked questions. I wanted her to see me. I had developed into a kid who used the group of the class to hide out. It didn't always work with Mrs. Picard. She didn't always call on the first or even the second person to raise their hand, but sometimes she did. She tried to call on everyone. With Mrs. Picard, I couldn't avoid getting called on by turning my head away or raising my hand first or not raising my hand. Besides being really smart in this way, she also liked us and was nice to all of us as a group and even one at a time. She was fair. She wanted us to learn and to act right. She had fun every day teaching us. Something Mrs. Picard did that I thought was amazing and I loved was that she let the kids who had finished whatever work the class was quietly doing go to the tower part of the room where all the free reading books were. until time for our next subject. The tower was so cool. From outside, it was a real tower going up one corner of the building. Inside, it was a round part of the classroom added on to one corner of the room. In our room part of the tower, there were windows, and even the panes of the windows were curved to fit the circle. Sitting and reading, I could also see the sycamore tree outside, as tall as the third floor where we were. The leaves were like a curtain out there, and they sounded so friendly when the wind blew. I always watched the limbs and leaves blow in the rain. Sometimes I would be reading when Mrs. Picard called me to come back to my desk for the new subject, and I didn't hear her because I was lost in the book I was reading. Do you know what she did? She walked over to me and touched my shoulder and said, "Margaret, time for geography." She never got mad about not paying attention, not once. Mrs. Picard knew we liked to be read to after lunch, so she always did. When this first started for me in fourth grade, I worried she would fall off the tall stool she always sat on. First, she scooted up on the stool, then crossed her legs, then reset her glasses, then focused on the book, and finally started to read. It all looked so awkward, I worried she might fall off the stool just wiggling around like that. But soon I didn't notice, because the stories were so good. I wish I could remember all the books she read a chapter of each day before we started our afternoon activities. But now I can remember only one, Little Britches by Ralph Moody. It's the story of a boy whose family moves out west before the turn of the 20th century to try to get a fresh start. Just as they arrive, the father dies suddenly, and Ralph, who is the oldest of quite a few, and his mother support the family. I was the oldest kid in my family too, and although I didn't have to work to help out, we had added 2 baby sisters in just the past year and a half. Family life had gotten busier, more confusing, and just harder. This story was a comfort. It allowed me to worry less about what seemed pretty overwhelming, and it combined with the orderliness of school and our teacher caring for us. I looked forward to school and being read to every day by Mrs. Picard, who read just right, who read in such a way that her voice in the fourth grade room disappeared and the story took over the whole world. Our next reader is Jerry.
Thanks, Margaret. I'm Jerry Thompson. This took place in Brantford, Connecticut in early June of 1947. I was about 10 years old when I signed up to play baseball in the Brantford Pee Wee Baseball League, run by an excellent coach who was likable and a respected young man named Joe Orsini. He managed the whole operation. He put together the rosters, created the schedules, umpired all of our games, and coached us every Saturday morning. The kids were from 10 to 15 years old. Games were played at Hammer Field, where the Brantford Townies played their games, as did the Brantford High School team. I can still recall my first time at bat in the Brantford Pee Wee Baseball League. The pitcher was a tall, slender black kid named Addison Long, who was about 15 years old. A rugged kid named Bob Massey was the catcher, and of course, Joe Orsini was the umpire. When I stepped to the plate, Addison had a big smile on his face as he sized me up, a skinny, scared 10-year-old. Massey, who was a 13-year-old, spoke to me with a slight stutter. "He's going to give you a nice fat pitch to hit, so be sure to swing the ball." Addison went into a slow, intimidating windup, kicked his left foot upward as his right arm stretched out behind him, then brought his arm over the top and released the ball. It sped toward me as if it had been fired from a Springfield rifle, as the ball cut across the center of the plate waist high with a sound thwack as a cloud of dust puffed from the pocket of the catcher's mitt. I had stood at the plate frozen. Ball, Joe Orsini, the umpire shouted. Come on, Joe, that was right down the middle, Massey, the catcher, complained. Joe responded, give the kid a chance. I was wishing I had stayed home to help my grandfather work in his garden. Addison again went into his slow wind up and fired another pitch. It was another blazer. He wasn't letting up the speed. Ball, Joe shouted. Massey shouted, come on, Joe, you know that the pitch was a strike. Again, Addison went into the wind-up. This time, when he released the ball, it came toward the plate at a moderate speed. Strike, Joe announced. I knew I could have hit that one. I dug in for the next pitch. Once again, Addison pitch came into the moderate speed and over the plate. I swung and hit a ground ball to the second baseman, who scooped it up and raced towards first base. He tossed the ball to the first baseman, and I was out. It wasn't great, but it wasn't bad either. At least I hit the ball. I played second base that summer, and none of the pitchers I faced were as scary as Addison Long, and I was able to get a few hits without help with Joe Orsini. Our next reader is Mary.
Thank you, Jerry. I'm Mary DiRocco. I'm going to read two short memoir poems about a messy and miraculous adolescence. Poetry. See it in a girl slipping a second step into adolescence, searching for her silenced voice among shelves, library, bookstore. Poetry, a thin paperback cover, black and white, phantasmagoric night, lights big bright, delight in dreams unseen, a Coney Island of the mind. Johnny Nolan has a patch on his ass. Kids chase him through screen door summers, through the back streets of all my memories. Left around the house, carried to tatters, my father enraged, seizes and shreds, in madness he spits. What filth is this? Next day, grab the bus to Hartford, resolved, walk down Asylum Street to the bookstore, purchase again. Seeking, searching shelves, she finds Ginsberg following Ferlinghetti. Thin, small, squared paperback, black and white. Here, in poetry, she finds her voice, her weapon, her shield. This is my second poem. It's called Outspoken Heart. But one thing is certain, if we merge mercy with might and might with right, then love becomes our legacy and change our children's birthright. The Hill We Climb, Amanda Gorman. Looking back, I searched for loves. I knew, I grew, I left, adieu. For clues, the glue that pieced my heart together. Out of my first love, Oedipal love, inedible love, a broken heart grew, this outspoken heart, which later found art to kickstart a different life from the family life. Yes, there was strife, but somehow I midwifed a new life with my palette knife and canvas white. Despite the blues, I found the light. I'd be all right, and I was, and I am. At 15, unseen, I flee, I spree to Tambourine, the yellow submarine, searching in my youth, lurching toward my truth. Who sees love? Who seizes love? Who? I, a black sheep, they tried to put to sleep. But my escape brought me where the seascape fills my dreamscape, marks my heart shape, shapes my life ship, seeds my love from above, where my life vest is my grace note and keeps my outspoken heart afloat. Thank you. And our next reader and our final reader is Bill.
Thanks, Mary. That was great. My name is Bill Charette, and I'm going to read from an excerpt from a longer piece that I wrote about a lot of different jobs I had early in life. This is called Somewhere Over the Rainbow. At the age of 17, I answered an ad promising big money in the exciting world of sales. I attended a recruitment meeting where a charismatic salesman, Richard Domingo, mesmerized all with his tale of success through the sale of the Rainbow vacuum cleaner. He was a short, wiry, animated character with a crop of thick black hair. He wore a tailored three-piece suit, tie loosened slightly, top shirt buttoned open, a rakish Mick Jagger-like smile always at the ready. He had the gift of gab. He could talk a dog off a meat wagon. I was enthralled. All I had to do was sell a couple of vacuum cleaners a week, and I could achieve the flashy lifestyle he lived, with an adoring wife, a large house, fancy car, gold jewelry, the whole 9 yards. I was on my way to riches and luxury. The first order of business was to learn the flip chart demo designed to convince that the vacuum cleaner you owned was spreading almost as much dirt as it was picking up, thus jeopardizing the health of everyone in the house. To illustrate the point, we would produce an artificial beam of sunlight using a small metal shaded light to dramatically reveal dust billowing out the exhaust of your Electrolux or the bag of your Kirby Deluxe upright. One good slap at the porous bag of a roaring upright with our handheld lamp would reveal jaw-dropping clouds of dust swirling in the beam of light. The same effect was achieved by raking the light across a rug and holding it up to further prove that the machine you were using was leaving a lot of dirt behind. We explained that the Rainbow, which was shaped a bit like R2-D2, was originally designed as an air cleaner. Instead of a bag, it used a clear lucite tank of water at the base of the machine to trap dust and dirt. Nothing was emitted from its exhaust but clean, fresh air, free of germ-spreading filth. The damn thing was loud as a rocket, but we boasted it could also be used as an air filter, capable of ridding your home of airborne dust. Now, which would you prefer? The disease-spreading machine you are currently using, or a health-promoting Rainbow? A salesman's goal was to do at least 2 demonstrations a night to achieve the most sales. Much time was spent on the phone trying to make evening and weekend appointments when husbands and wives were both at home. Though the Rainbow was as good or better at cleaning than many others, the price was greatly inflated to support the many players getting a cut of the action. The proceeds from each overpriced machine were divided among salesman, office manager, regional manager, and so on. In 1964, the price of a Rainbow was about $300. Today, a contemporary version of the same machine is listed for just under $3,000. Just as ridiculous now as it was then. It wasn't hard to get people excited about the machine. That was the easy part. Once they heard the price, the real work began. The pressure was on to close the sale by overcoming every possible excuse not to buy. I managed to sell maybe 2 or 3 machines a month. And as I look back, I'm amazed that I found any buyers at all. It wasn't long before I dreaded the job as reality set in. I could sense when a sale was hopeless early in the pitch. Typically, a husband unimpressed by the free set of fine plastic handle steak knives for just listening to a sales pitch exhibited the behavior of a man who has been tricked into an appointment with a marriage counselor. I'd skip through the flip chart as fast as I could to cut my losses, thank them for their time, and was on my way. Driving home, I'd feel guilty, but relieved to have the ordeal over with. A couple more dead-end jobs followed my failed attempt at sales, laying down asphalt driveways and working a soul-crushing overnight shift in a plastic factory. Then a chance encounter with an acquaintance who was attending a school in Boston for radio, television, and theater led to the next brighter chapter in my journey. So that's it. And we're going to turn it over now to Rosalind, who will take over. Roz?
So thank you, everybody. Just wonderful, wonderful stories. And what we want to do now is open it up to for any of you who would like to comment or ask a question or maybe share a memory or piece of your own life with us.
Roz, can you read that quote by Muriel Rukeyser again, or can you send it? Because that's a wonderful quote for any memoir group.
Yeah, it's Muriel Rukeyser. It's Rukeyser. And she said that the universe is connected by stories, not atoms.
Grace.
Yes. I'm so happy that a lot of the stories were very good, and Judith and Josh Stiles I thought were really funny, and I appreciate that. When Josh said about intense concentration with the squinting eyes, like his grandmother when she made Wheatina, I really enjoyed that. For some reason, that struck me as very funny. And Judith about men who buy pottery, and that one who bought it became her husband. Very funny. So I enjoyed a lot of the stories. Thank you.
Yeah, and thanks, Grace. And I could mention that Grace was part of the Memoirs Group for many years, some years ago, and went on to complete her memoir, which is published.
Yes, thank you.
And you can get a copy.
Yes.
And probably also get it out from the library, right?
Yes. You can only buy it on Amazon because I haven't figured out how to get stores to get it. Maybe if somebody understands, they should please tell me. But Amazon hasn't told me. They have a vested interest in not telling me, I suppose. But in other words, you just have to go to Amazon Books.
Yeah.
Thank you. Enough of all that.com.
Enough of all that.
Thank you.
I'd just like to say that I think your group just proved your quote from Muriel Rukeyser, because especially post-COVID, the whole group of readers just brought that into real life. It seems like we've been cut off for so long. And those details in the stories took me back to places and times and different things that were real and didn't seem separated. So it joined everybody here, I think, in a way that Muriel Rukeyser says it does.
I just wanted to say how nice it was to be back with all of you, even if it's a virtual meeting. And what a treat to go to Branford again. and the back in the elevator. I remember that first time. And of course, how could I forget Margaret in school? So it was just like a wonderful homecoming to go back to those early days. And I'm almost done, and I'll be back.
All right.
Good. Yeah. It'll be great to have you back.
Thank you.
Margaret.
I just want to tell Susie how much I loved that story. That was an absolute delight of the details. and delicious ones. Thank you so much, Susie. It was great.
That's one of the interesting things that very often we discover when we write our memoirs is that when we think about where we came from, we sort of discover that, well, guess what? I'm doing the same thing, or, you know, I've brought these folks right along with me.
Well, I just want to say thank you to this memoirs group for getting us through the pandemic. It was like getting a transfusion every Monday morning. And I'm sure everyone else who showed up Monday mornings all through that uncertain time feels the same way. And it was also very inspiring. Thank you.
Just want to say what a privilege it's been to be able to be a member of the group every single week on Zoom, as opposed to those rare Mondays when I'd be able to attend up on the Cape. So it's been a wonderful way of getting through the pandemic.
Yeah, for all our complaints about Zoom, it does serve a really important function. Yeah.
Another thing, I've said this before, that you think you're all, you know your life, and then you start to write about it in a group as affirming and interested as this one, and the responses help you look at certain parts of your life and yourself in a different way. And I know I've really grown tremendously along the line, looking at things that I thought I knew so well, and just defining those times differently because of your responses. So I just wanted to say that it's been a wonderful experience, and we're getting older together, and we'll face whatever comes, but it's just a wonderful group. I love being in it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Roz, for your incredible generosity. Really, it's quite,
Right.
yeah, and it's wonderful to have a teacher we so deeply trust guide us, who's also a poet that we can be proud. And you mentioned her name to some poets down here, and they go, "Oh my goodness, Roz!" You were quoted in a poetry workshop. A poet I know that I admire is Roz, and they said something about you, and I thought, I'm in the memoir group with her.
Well, the secret, I think, of bringing together a really good group of people interested in writing their memoirs is that you really just have to listen carefully to what anybody is saying, and listen for where you sense the story, and by setting up certain good ways of responding to each other's work, everybody becomes extremely skilled listeners. And I don't know. I'm just thinking, geez, if I ran the world, that's the matter with everything. Nobody listens carefully to anybody else. They all just, so everything's a mess. But listening is key. And so when we hear what anybody has written, we pay attention to the parts that are particularly vivid, or that we still resonate in our heads after we hear the story, and that tells the writer where the high points of what has been written are. And then to listen for places. Oh, you mentioned your Aunt so and so, or the apple tree in your backyard, and I'd really like to I'd really like to know more about that. And that gives the writer some sense of where it can be expanded, windows that you can go through to explore. Sometimes those windows end up being leading to very surprising rooms in the house of your memory. And then the third thing is that, and I'm sure this happened to everybody listening today, is as you listen to each piece, oh gosh, that reminds me of when I used to go to my grandfather's house, and every Sunday afternoon we'd play parcheesi, or we'd watch some sports event on television, or oh, that reminds me of. And so we share with the writer how what we've heard has touched a responsive chord in our own lives, and that tells the writer where, if where the piece really lands. I mean, that's why we write, that's why we tell stories. We want to make a connection to the listener, to the reader, to somebody else. So that's how it works. Yeah. And I can't believe this is so thrilling for me to watch everybody's writing develop and cohere and find new surprising pathways into the story that you eventually tell, put together about some aspect of how you got to be where you are.
There. I think it's interesting too, where we said about entertaining a child or making an impression on a child, because it doesn't just last for that moment, but it can shape through and across time into the future and shape your life. And I think all of the memoirs that we hear and that we as listeners connect to show that to be true. Those hit us as real things in this world, not some of the terrible things that we're hearing now and people making up things, but we can connect with those realities.
And in Diane's case, I remember when you came and you kind of didn't have you didn't know what you were going to write about, or what, you just were sort of interested, and I think what I said was, it doesn't make any difference what you write about, just the first thing that just pops into your head, write that down and just see where that goes. The story about the magician was, it opened up this window to kind of see the through line in your life story, how magic or magical moments shaped it.
When I was thinking about writing and quite convinced that I couldn't, I was swimming with Rosalind off of Fisher Beach, and I remember her saying to me, "Well, Chris, the word essay means to try."
And I wanted to say something about why I trust you so much, Roz, is that I've been in a lot of workshops with writing teachers who know a lot, but this thing you just described about piece by piece hearing in a kind of modest way, not let me sort this piece out, or let me tell you something different, or let me challenge you, but hearing what's being attempted from the heart and encouraging that in a way that's, I feel feedback from you is true, it's reasonable, it's, I'm using the word modest again, because I think your stance towards us is modest. You're sharing what you discover in terms of each person. And you can feel the difference when someone makes a suggestion and it's not about what your voice is in that moment, it's about something else. And it's quite painful when that happens. It can shut you down or make you wonder. And your steady encouragement with equality, there's a sense of respect and equality with every writer that comes in.
Mm-hmm.
And it's amazing to watch the growth, because I was away for a while, and to come back and see how people grew in their writing and in the way they spoke about it. I know I can learn that. I can learn from people and what they say, and I take it seriously. And so you've built a group that I think has a lot of trust in each other, and it's delicate, that, because that's, it's vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a wonderful way that you have. And I just wanted to describe it because I've been thinking about it just as you were speaking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I I find it sort of funny that I mentor this terrific memoirs group, and I haven't written a memoir. I'm not writing, I'm not a memoirist. I don't know. I'm not an expert. I don't know anything. I read, but I think that puts me in a very good place, actually, because I don't have any kind of preconceived idea for what a good memoir ought to have in it. I absolutely would not be able to run this as a class where on the first day I ask everybody to write this, and then the second day to run it, you know what I mean? That it has to be an individual, highly personal journey that each writer takes, word by word, sentence by sentence, piece by piece. And that journey is, you get so that you get more comfortable or more familiar, or I guess the word is more sure of where you're putting your feet down in your own story, and what kinds of things you're writing about and what kinds of things aren't part of your story at all, even though they happen to you. It's a memoir is a made thing. You choose what goes in it. You discover what the through line is, what the story is, so that the blurb on the jacket of your published book can say, this is an amazing story about how blah, 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 comma, blah, 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 period.
This is that listening is so important. And in bringing up children, for example, listening is also so important. And then you observe and you listen, and that's a pretty good part of life, and it's a pretty good way to write, that you've listened and then you come to the group and people listen to you, and it works very nicely. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Diane.
I just want to say, similar to what Bridget said, the level of trust in this group is just really wonderful. And it was framed, I believe, Roz, by you from the very beginning about how to listen. And, if you want more, say, I want to hear more about, Aunt Bessie, or maybe I got confused there, but none of it is an attack. And I think that for those of us who have been in writing groups where we feel eviscerated, we come out, we never want to write another word. And people have come to this group saying, well, I don't know if I can, and I've never written. And pretty soon they're just one of us. And it is a beautiful, beautiful experience to have and that we have writing teachers in the room and people who really have a lot of content to offer. It's just been swell. Just swell.
Indeed.
Nicely said, Diane.
So thank you all so much, and thanks to all of you who joined us.
Thanks, Roz. Thanks,
Yeah.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.